I see these lectures as an attempt to meander shamelessly through a subject, so don't expect too much in the way of a linear argument. As the title suggests, I began, when Alan asked me to think about childhood, or whether I'd want to think about childhood and talk about it, I began thinking about our attachment to it and what our attachment might mean, and attachment to children on the part of adults, and where that comes from and what are its sources in our culture. And I began with a book which I remember reading a very long time ago by a historian called Lawrence Stone. It's called The Family, Sex and Marriage, and it's an archivally based historical account of the evolution of attachment to childhood in England from 1500 to 1800, more or less. And if I can shamelessly simplify the argument, I think what he was attempting to show sociologically was that there was a great transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And in the Middle Ages, he argued, people were very wary of getting too attached to their children, particularly up to the age of, say, 5 or 7, because childhood was such an age of vulnerability. Children died at such a high rate that you couldn't afford to invest too much emotion in them because you were constantly torn apart by their death, and that this changed as medicine improved and welfare conditions improved, and that by the end of the 18th century, people began to become much more attached to children and became more interested in the idea of child experience. And his book, of course, is really about England. But I was thinking, well, is this really true? It's sociologically interesting, but is it really true that people didn't dare to think of children as deeply affecting human creatures? And then I returned to the place where I began the last time I spoke here on a very different subject, and I was thinking about Francis of Assisi, one of the great figures in Italy of the Middle Ages. And Francis, as I explored last time, Francis was a catalytic figure in Italian culture precisely because he attempted to make the Bible, I think, more humanly approachable. And what he encouraged in people was a far more emotional approach to the church and its teachings. And he encouraged the church, in turn, to be much more emotional, to be much more theatrical, to take advantage, so to speak, of the deeply human, poignant aspects of the Christian story. And one of the texts, it's a sentence, one of the texts that was extremely dear to Francis's heart. Sorry, I'm grappling with an unfamiliar noting system here. Matthew 19:14. If I can find the decent version. Yes, but Jesus said, "Suffer little children and forbid them not to come to me, for such is the kingdom of heaven." Now, how did Francis translate that off? How did Francis take that and make it central to his way of bringing God to ordinary, often very poor people in the Italian Middle Ages? Well, one of the things he did was to establish the Nativity as one of the central stories that would be brought to people, to make people think about the fact that God became a man and succumbed to the ills of mortality, that he entered the womb of a human woman and succumbed to the experience of being born, and he was born as a refugee who couldn't find a house in which to be born. He had to be born in a stable. And Francis wanted people who themselves were living in places not much better than a stable, and often considerably worse than a stable. He wanted those people to feel that this religion for the poor, for the vulnerable, was for them. And it was by making childhood, the childhood of Jesus Christ, such a central feature of the imaginative experience of being a Christian. And it was hugely effective as a method. And its effects can still be seen very movingly in works of art such as this one, created by Giotto. It's part of the great cycle of fresco paintings in Padua, and it shows us the Nativity. It shows us Christ's vulnerability. It's emphasized, I think, if you like, the nature of Christ's early life, very early life, as a refugee is emphasized by Giotto in this, you could say, stage set architecture. It's not a real landscape, but what is it? It's the idea of a barren place in which a miracle is happening. Joseph sleeps and Mary is there. And it's very, very touching. And Francis didn't just encourage this, as you probably know, he didn't just encourage this in art. At Greccio, I think in 1208, he instituted something which continues vividly in Italy today, namely the notion that at Christmas time, we, the people of our village, will make a nativity. We will actually create from little models, little dolls. Sometimes they can be life-size. They can be in a local church, or they can just be in the hearth of the family home. And the people often who are given the greatest responsibility for placing the figures within this Italian tradition are actually children. So you, in a sense, what Francis invented with this idea of the Nativity was a kind of doll's house in which you engage with the notion of Christ as a child, Christ's childhood, in your own childhood, absolutely viscerally, in the sense that you're not only thinking about it as a little boy or a little girl, but you're being invited to make your own version of it and to decide whether Joseph should be, perhaps a little bit closer to Mary than he is here, because you'd like him to be with his wife at this moment, or you can decide that he should be there where he is, and you can arrange the animals in their stable. And it's tremendously, tremendously powerful. And all of that suggests to me that no matter how well researched and convincing, in a sense, Lawrence Stone's book is, and I don't want to sort of discredit it in any way, I think it's the truth is more complicated, and no matter how people may have attempted not to become attached to children and childhood and the idea of a child's vulnerability, I doubt personally very much whether they ever truly managed the trick. And Francis, who was a genius at knowing how people's emotions work and how to hook into their emotions to bring them into the church, he plainly realized that medieval people were extremely attached to their children, because if they hadn't been, I don't think this new cult of celebrating the idea and the image, both in painting form and sculpturally, of the Nativity could ever taken root in the way that it did. And the parallel to all of that, if you like, there is a parallel in some of the literature that we know. Michael Baxendale, many years ago, wrote a brilliant book called Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy. So he's moving us forward a little bit in time. And one of the things that he looked at with great diligence and wonderful, as it were, ferreting out in the archives, was he looked at meditations for prayer and manuals for prayer, these texts in which priests told each other how to tell their congregations to pray. And one of them, I'm paraphrasing, but one of them goes along the lines of this. So if you're telling your congregation how to sympathize or to engage with some of the early scenes of Christ's life, you might, for example, think about the massacre of the innocents. And when you think and pray about the story of the massacre of the innocents, you might wish to imagine some of the children in your village being the children who are murdered. And you might, I don't think they quite say that, the butcher is a bad man, but they say, and you might wish to find somewhere among the faces of your village a man who might, in your imagination, play the part of Herod. So you are, as it were, being invited to people your imagination with a prayer based on the real faces and the real figures and the real forms of those around you, which one might say is almost a kind of, it's another version of what Francis is suggesting that you do when you arrange a nativity. You are peopling your imagination with real images. And, sorry, I'm getting confused between my notes and my images. I've just put this up because it's one of my favourite paintings in the National Gallery. It's by a not terribly famous artist called Geertken tot Sint-Jans, and it's called The Nativity at Night. And it's, again, just such a wonderful image. It's a very, very rare thing in the sense that it's an early Renaissance nocturne, so it's a painting set at night, which is very, very unusual. There are very, very few such images. It's not really till the end of the 16th century that we find, well, in the work of Caravaggio and artists such as Adam Elsheimer shortly before him, we find such extremes of light and darkness. And again, I think it's another way. It's not Giotto's rocky place to emphasize the hostility of the world in which this child is born, but it's using darkness to suggest the aloneness and the vulnerability of this moment of birth, in which there is light, but the light is all heavenly. It's the light shed by the angel in the sky. You probably can't see on this representation, but I think I remember some shepherds sort of waking up in the background, and they're about to come and venerate Christ. Forgive my pauses. Oh, sorry, very annoying machine sometimes. Right. Okay. So, and I think, again, talking of the Massacre of the Innocents, this is a painting by Rubens, which was placed on loan to the National Gallery. I think the owner is, David Thompson, the Canadian millionaire. And this is Rubens thinking about Caravaggio. Rubens, when he painted this picture, had just come in contact with Caravaggio's work. In fact, he'd made a box with his own hands for Caravaggio's Death of the Virgin, which he'd bought in his role of art dealer for the Duke of Mantua after it had been turned away from a Roman church, possibly because the Madonna in it was depicting a prostitute. But anyway, Rubens had boxed this picture up and sent it off to Mantua, and here he is thinking about Caravaggio and maybe wondering how Caravaggio might have painted the Massacre of the Innocents and coming up with his own extremely dramatic and troubling image. But again, it's a picture that rather gives the lie to anyone's idea that people didn't really think that children were touching or poignant or moving in the Europe of the 1600s. I suppose it's Rubens's way. And Rubens is a painter who's so much actually about life and fertility and fecundity. He's not, in a sense, or even when he's about death, he emphasizes the livingness of the forms that are going to die. And so there's something it's troubling in a very different way. These are the children, of course, who die in the place of Christ. They're all killed in case one of them might be Christ, and none of them are. But how alive they are. They're like plump fruit being smashed against Roman stone. That's Rubens thinking about the vulnerability of the child. And this is one of the paintings that Rubens probably would have been looking at. This is the Conversion of Paul by Caravaggio, painted for the Funerary Chapel of Tiberio Chirazi, papal treasurer. And there are two paintings by Caravaggio in this chapel, and there's a painting by Annibale Carracci as well in the middle, over the altar. They were all commissioned at the same time. They were all done at the same time. Carracci's painting, it shows the soul of the Virgin Mary rising to heaven. And it's very much a proto-Baroque image in which Mary and the apostles are all dressed very much as if they are aristocratic. They wear astonishingly rich robes, and their colours of their robes are very, very dramatic and bright. As Caravaggio's painting is exactly the opposite of that. His are the colours of earth and the colours of humility, the colours of dullness, the colours of poverty. Caravaggio is flaunting the fact that he spent very, very little money on the paint, whereas Carracci must have spent a fortune on his paint. And Caravaggio is very conspicuously turning the arse of his horse so that it faces the Virgin in Carracci's altarpiece, which is just a few feet away. What's this picture got to do with childhood? We see St. Paul, Saul, who is on his way to do bad things to Christians, suddenly converted to be a Christian himself by a thunderbolt from God. And he's struck from his horse, and he lies on the ground. There's a depiction of the same subject by Michelangelo in the Pauline Chapel, which is next to the Sistine Chapel, which hardly anyone ever gets to see because it's the Pope's private devotional chapel, in which Michelangelo depicted this in much more Hollywood style, as a cast of hundreds. People reel in astonishment as God comes down from the heavens to strike Paul with his thunderbolt. And Caravaggio excises all of that to leave us contemplating only the horse, only the groom, and only the figure of St. Paul lying on the ground. Where is the church? The church is Santa Maria del Popolo, and you'll still see if you go to Rome today that it stands by a great gate. And the great gate, made of stone, once marked the outer boundary of Rome. Beyond it now is just part of the endless urban sprawl of modern commercial Rome, a street with about 400 pizzerias in it. But back then it was just fields, and fields going north. So on a Jubilee year, when pilgrimage was made to Rome, maybe 50,000 pilgrims, poor people coming to pray for their brother who's ill, or their son who's got leprosy, or their husband who's damaged his arm in an accident at the mill. This is the first church that they come to. And what has Caravaggio done? He's very carefully made those poor people feel at home in a way that I'm sure would have been greatly approved of by St. Francis, in whose spiritual footsteps Caravaggio always walks. And he's made this scene resemble a nativity, I think. And I think if you come into the church as a poor pilgrim in 1601, and you see this picture for the first time, you are put in mind perhaps of those nativity scenes that you helped to arrange when you were a child. And then you wonder where the ox is, and you realize that the horse isn't an ass, and then you realize that actually it's not the subject that you thought it was. But the association has been triggered. And I think there's another association here too, which is with where you live. Because peasants in northern Italy at this time lived with their animals, because the animals were central heating. So you would have the animals in the house, and you would live above the animals so that the heat rising from their bodies would warm you. And I think Caravaggio is very carefully creating a painting of a miracle that looks like your house. So this is your house. This church is for you. This place is for you. And how does Caravaggio express, and he's triggering these associations that you might have with your childhood. And conversion in Caravaggio's depiction of it reminds me very much of that phrase that Francis cleaved to, suffer the little children, because at the moment of Paul's conversion, he becomes like a child. He is helpless like a child. His eyes are closed. He becomes blind, actually, for 3 days in the story. So he cannot see anything except the light that is flooding him inside. So he is illuminated from within, but he is helpless as a child. And what is he experiencing? He is experiencing a mystic understanding of the significance of Christ's vulnerable birth, all the way through to Christ's equally vulnerable death. And that sense of the proximity of death and life, we are born astride the grave, as Beckett would write much later, which is such a terrifying thought and idea. And as we get older, we realize that we do seem to be accelerating. But that proximity between birth and death is here given another charge, because what Caravaggio has done is he's depicted Paul, yes, as the infant Christ, the child Christ, but he's also the adult Christ on the cross. And it's within that brilliant, because he's such a brilliant artist, as you know, I would say that, but he is, this idea that he's experiencing the whole life of Christ from the alpha to the omega, from the child to the adult dying on the cross, all in one moment of conversion, is brilliantly compressed into this image. This is a much, much later painting. Well, Caravaggio's life wasn't very long, so one can't really say that, but it's a later painting. It's a very moving painting. When Caravaggio himself was a child, when he was 5, Milan, where he was brought up, was struck by plague. Excuse me. Milan was struck by plague. And he was, because he had contacts, his family had some contacts with the Colonna family, he was given permission to escape the city of Milan, which no one else was allowed to do, really. But he and his family were allowed, and they went back to his native village of Caravaggio. And there, in the archives, you'll find a very sad series of testimonies to what happened next. The ceremonies, the testimonies take the form of notices of death. Caravaggio's father dies, his uncle dies, his grandparents die. All the men in Caravaggio's life die within a period of about 7 days, because they'd taken the plague with them. And here we find Caravaggio, after he's committed the murder of Ranuccio Tomasoni and gone on the run and escaped to Naples and then gone on the run to Malta and assaulted a man in Malta and gone on the run again and ended up in Sicily. Here he is painting a very, very late depiction of the Nativity. It's a sort of sister painting to a depiction of St. Lucy. And I can't help feeling that this is Caravaggio, probably unconsciously. He's very much in touch with himself. Caravaggio painting his own sense of himself as a refugee through this image of the Nativity, the Holy Family as refugees. And it's, I find it an almost unbearable painting to look at, because there she is. Mary is the refugee mother, and Christ is the refugee child, and the shepherds who were waking up at the back of Gierken Tot-Sint-Jans's painting, the shepherds have now arrived. And there they are. And they want to help. They really want to help. They want to reach out and they want to take care of this child and this mother, these two refugees. But something stops them from being able to do it. It's as if there's a force field that separates those men reaching out towards that woman and that child. I think it's Caravaggio's way of saying, well, that there is no help for it. I will not be saved. And I think it's him in an age before the cult of childhood reflection and reminiscence. He's actually painting his sense of himself as a child. And those shepherds are all the men that died who can't help him. And it's that poignancy that is the subject of the picture. It's well worth going to see. I think this may have even been on the cover of Lawrence Stone's book, and it's an extremely convincing vision of why perhaps you might think that in 16th century England people didn't have the most tremendously sentimental attitude towards their children. The Chumley sisters, with their identical Elizabethan kit-form babies, staring out impassively at us in a way that makes one feel that perhaps there is something of English reserve. And I'm going to definitely meander quite a lot at this point, but I'm interested. This picture is Elizabethan. Now, what happens in the period that? Well, of course, it's before Caravaggio, so I am going back. But Caravaggio, the line between Caravaggio and St. Francis has not been cut in Italy in his life. I mean, they're cutting it. People are trying to cut it. But it hasn't yet been cut, and Caravaggio is the living embodiment of it. But it's a sort of collision. The Renaissance is a difficult period to understand, but there are different things that are going on at different times. But there is a common tendency, I would argue, that crosses from Italy and France to England. And one of the leitmotifs of Renaissance humanist discourse is the association of people who are very emotional with stupidity. So Michelangelo, when he wants to say that somebody doesn't really know what they're talking about, he says, that's the sort of thing that a priest would say, or a woman would say, or a child would say, i.e., as stupid as a woman, as stupid as a child, as stupid as a priest, because those people are led by their hearts, not their head, and they're stupid. And Michelangelo's not an artist without emotion, but he's quite disdainful of it in many ways. And you can see Caravaggio's art. Caravaggio is, in a way, and in some of his art, it's very explicit. He's saying, well, I don't agree with you, Michelangelo. In fact, I don't really like what you did. We happen to have the same name, which makes me like it even less, and I'm very competitive. And so I'll make a point of it. But in some of Caravaggio's pictures, which are very much about the importance of having emotion and the importance of allowing yourself to have emotion, he includes little references to Michelangelo paintings which definitely don't really have that kind of emotional charge, which are much more intellectual. And the same kind of humanism that feeds Michelangelo's ideas about women and children and priests, it can be found in other areas of the Renaissance. For example, Sigismondo Malatesta, who built the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini, which is this huge, mad marble bas-relief church interior, full of tremendously arcane and strange classical symbols, which were all created within a scheme that could be exonerated at the level of Christianity, but only after you'd done 20 cryptic crossword puzzles would you understand that this image of Diana actually stands for the Virgin. Anyway, what did he cover over with that? He covered over a whole series of frescoes by Giotto with this marble intellectual framework of the new art, the new humanism. He was a thug, but he'd been educated, so he wanted to prove to everybody that he was really educated. And one of his courtiers said, well, why on earth have you made a church into an intellectual construct, into this classical temple thing? And the answer came back from one of the humanist advisors, was that if we did it like they used to do it in the past, ordinary people might understand it. Ordinary people might understand it, which I would argue that way of thinking, which is also enshrined to a certain degree in Giorgio Vasari and the way that he writes about art, is really the antecedent of modern conceptualism, and the idea that art should only really be understood. I mean, it wouldn't now be women and children, because that would be too politically incorrect, saying that women, children, and priests are stupid. But the idea is that someone is stupid and we're intelligent. And that idea of elitism very much militates against, as it developed during the Renaissance, it very much militated against any involvement or any sympathy with this idea of childhood and this idea of vulnerability and this idea of being moved by the fact that God became a baby, not just a person, but a baby. You mustn't be moved by any of that, because it's undignified and it's not intellectual. And one of the things that it's responsible for an awful lot of mistakes. And what that humanism, I'm simplifying, but what that humanism turns to within the English intellectual tradition is the Protestant Reformation. As if you look at someone like Thomas More, I think one of the most telling stories told by Thomas More that helps to explain why the British did what they did. He says, I was sitting next to two women on a coach, and I heard them talking. And one woman said to the other, where are you going on pilgrimage to? And she said, oh, I'm going to Canterbury. Why are you going to Canterbury? Because the Virgin at Canterbury is really great. You pray to her and your son will get better. Like that, she's absolutely fantastic. But anyway, where are you going to? And the second woman says, oh, I'm going to Barking. because the Virgin at Barking is far better than the Virgin at Canterbury. And I find that if I pray to the Virgin at Barking, it always works. And Thomas More then concludes, having reported this conversation, you see how stupid these women are. You see how stupid they are. They think that the sculpture is the Virgin Mary. And they ask themselves, where is the real Virgin Mary? And woman A thinks that she's found the real Virgin Mary, and it's that piece of stone. And woman 2 thinks she's found the Virgin Mary, and it's that piece of wood in Barking, the one with jointed arms and legs that the priest moves at the back. And so was begotten the English Reformation, which resulted in the destruction of 99.7% of all British art between 1530 and 1600. But it's very much an attack, I would argue, it's an attack on emotion, it's an attack on engagement, and it's to do with a fear that if you become too emotionally engaged with a particular nativity or a particular image, a particular painting, you'll actually mistake the figures in the painting. They'll become a totem rather than an aid to prayer, which is what they are for those composers of meditation on prayers. They're saying that the Giotto just helps you, and you take the Giotto away and you remake it in your own imagination, but you continue to engage really with the story that's in the Bible. There's no confusion in your mind that you're not confusing the little baby in the Giotto painting with Jesus Christ. But the Protestants feel that that is exactly the danger of what you might do. And they throw the baby out, literally, since we're talking about childhood, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They destroy all the art in case you should make the mistake, and they leave you with the word and the sermon as the way of getting to God. And you can see this reflected in the architecture of, well, you can't see it very many places because the Church of England's so ashamed of what it did that it has to try. It's remade most of the churches in England in such a way that they no longer reflect quite the priorities of the Reformation. But there's a place in Withersdale Street, for example, where you can see very clearly how they've taken the rood screen down, they've got rid of the image of Christ, and they've put a pulpit in, and they've painted the whole place white. And at the far end, where there was once an altarpiece, there is now the 10 Commandments written on a piece of wood. And what happens with that development, I think, is very much, well, as I say, it's a retreat from emotion, and it's a retreat into a much more intellectualized approach. And the reason I'm going on about religion and childhood is that, sorry, I probably should have emphasized this earlier, is that you have to remember that for most people up to, say, 1600, 1650, the vast amount of their non-working, their non-toiling experience is actually religious. And much of the way in which they think about everything, about life, is religion. So they probably, in terms of works of art, when they relate to a child, it is invariably or will be Jesus. It won't be, they're not reading novels about what it was like when I was a child. They're not reading memoirs of a life in China. None of that stuff's available. It's a limited set of experiences. So therefore, the transformations that are made to that limited set of experiences are absolutely enormous. And it's interesting, on this subject, I often feel that Shakespeare is the artist who comes into this, as it were, purged emotional void of British culture, and understands very well that, gosh, these people have had it all taken away. There is no spectacle. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to emote with. There's nothing to relate to emotionally anymore because none of that's allowed. That's what theatre can do. So the greatest writer of theatre ever emerges at exactly the moment when the largest wholesale destruction of the holy theatre has taken place. And is it a coincidence? And is it a coincidence that Shakespeare, for example, writes very movingly about exactly these things that we're talking about, the vulnerability of the child? And there's the massacre of the innocents, I suppose you could say, as in Titus Andronicus, where children actually get eaten. But there's much sympathetic writing about the nature of childhood and children in Shakespeare. And I think it's perhaps the transference of energies from the church to secular literature that's taking place. So we move forward into the, key moment in the development of modern attitudes to childhood. I would say that the key moment in that is not the Renaissance, it's not the Reformation, it's not the Middle Ages, it's the Enlightenment. And you can see it in a number of places, that suddenly, around the years 1750 to 1780, 1790, you see this development of tremendously sympathetic images of children. Children, as it were, suddenly come into focus at this moment. So if you walk through art galleries quickly, which I quite often do because I think it's an interesting way to see the larger patterns of historical development, you can notice these funny things like, oh, suddenly I'm seeing children. You walk through the National Gallery quickly enough, and that's exactly what happens. So this is Chardin, and I suppose what he's doing is he's working within a kind of, in this picture, he's working within a sort of Dutch-ish tradition of the vanitas. And so the child is building the house of cards, and the house of cards is, of course, a very fragile thing. And you could say, if you wanted to be very Dutch and Calvinistic about it, you could say that the child has no free will. God will decide when the house of cards falls. He may live to be 100, he may live to only be 6, but he can't control it. And we're all going to die, and such is the nature of things. And yet that doesn't, for me, quite work with Chardin, because you nonetheless see that within that scheme of a moral reflection, he's actually very touched by the way that the child deliberates, the way that the child attempts to I think you can feel, what he's doing is, I don't know if you've ever tried to make a house of cards, but it's that moment when when you really have to let go of the card, and you want to let go in such a way that it falls the minimum height that it has to take its place on the pyramid stack below. And I think that's what he's depicting. He's depicting just the moment where the child is concentrating on very, very, very slowly lowering that card. And it's pure speculation, of course, but I think that for me, I think Chardin is perhaps also reflecting on the way in which this type of motor control, he remembers it. He remembers trying to make a house of cards. And I wonder if he doesn't also think that it's connected to painting. I have to be as careful as that when I put the paint on the canvas. And what I'm actually painting secretly is my own history. I'm painting a part of my own development when I paint this picture. And that every painting I make is a kind of house of cards. So what you might think of at first sight as a sort of slightly superior, puritanical adult view of childhood, uninfused with sentimentality, is perhaps rather different and is perhaps a declaration of fellow feeling between artist and child. It's another example. And this is a picture of two sisters. One of it's called The Young Schoolmistress, and the young schoolmistress is teaching the yet younger child part of her lessons, pointing to, I can't remember what the subject is, I think it's a school book of some kind, and she's helping her to learn her lessons and pointing to the pictures, and she has to perhaps identify what the pictures are. And I think, again, you could see it within certain historical contexts as a kind of moralizing picture about the importance of education or the importance of virtuous comportment, which it no doubt is. You know, these are two good sisters. One of them wants to learn and the other one wants to help the other one to learn. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think, again, if we're talking about people beginning to be interested in the state of childhood rather than the idea of the child, and rather than in the idea of the vulnerability of the child, as I was talking about more, really, with the case of earlier Renaissance depictions or medieval depictions of the infant Christ. We're not talking about vulnerability here. We're talking about a genuine interest in how a child turns into a grown-up. It's almost as if Chardin is painting a kind of fruit at different stages of its growth. You know, the little girl is a version of the older girl, but she's sort of like a blob. And she's a blob studying these blobs on the pages of the book in front of her, but she's a blob who will become like the other girl. And there's a kind of miracle and a mystery about that. And Chardin is very touched by it, and he expresses the notion of it, I think, in his own painterly language, which is to do with finish. That the girl, the elder girl with her sort of pointing pin, is more highly finished. And in fact, it's interesting, I've just remembered that when Lucian Freud was invited to participate in an exhibition at the National Gallery where each painter would paint a kind of homage or a version of another painting in the National Gallery, but in their own way. This was the picture that Lucian Freud chose to depict. But I think he only depicted the girl with the very red ear, whose ear becomes even redder, of course, in the Lucian Freud version. But she is the more highly finished of the two. My favourite picture of this kind is, this is a painting by Gainsborough of his two daughters, painted for himself, never finished. Molly and the Captain, as he called them. One of them was 4 at the time of the picture. One of them is 6. And they're holding hands in a wood, wearing a golden silk dress and a silver silk dress. Perhaps one of them is meant to represent the age of silver, the other the age of gold. There's 2 years that separate them. And it's one of the most tremendously poignant images that I know of small children. And again, I suppose in a way he's revisiting the territory of Chardin in the sense that you see 2 girls who are related to one another and are almost, well, you can't help feeling, are versions of one another, like our violin and viola player. You could imagine them painted at the age of 6 and the age of 4, and maybe the result might be rather like this. And the younger girl, Molly, is depicted with a wonderful sensitivity to the slight clumsiness of the 4-year-old, that her arms and legs are somehow less tense and organized than those of her sister. Her sister has more self-consciousness. She's more aware of herself. She's perhaps slightly posing. She's aware that she's being painted, whereas the little one clearly is not aware of anything except the butterfly that she is reaching towards, which, of course, as you all know, symbolizes the transience of the state of childhood and the transience of life. But I think what Gainsborough, if you bring up children one of the sadnesses of bringing up children is the loss of each stage. So when a 3-month-old becomes a 4-month-old, suddenly they're too big for their Moses basket, and you have to take the Moses basket to the charity shop because it's no longer of use. And that's when people start crying. And they're crying because they've lost the 3-month-old. And there's a point where you lose the 3-year-old, and you notice it because the hugs that you get are no longer the mad, impulsive hugs of the 3-year-old who's utterly abandoned to everything except the fact that you've come home and isn't it brilliant? No, when they get to be a 5-year-old, they're also thinking about something else. And when they get to be a 9-year-old, they maybe didn't have a day at school, and you're lucky if you get a kiss. And then when they're a 14-year-old, they've got a boyfriend on the phone or whatever. And it's, gosh, each phase, each time you look at your child, you see the memory of the child who wasn't there. And I think that's what this is a painting about, because Gainsborough can still see in Molly the captain, and he can see where one may go. And it's again, he's taken the sense of unfinished, because this was a painting purely created for himself. It was not for any audience or market. He was probably officially in his own mind, the justification for it was that he was in fact moving away from the very tight art of his early work, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews and so on. He was actually trying to develop a new, more Van Dyckian style, and this was an essay in this new Van Dyckian style, which would make him rich and famous in England. But this is pretty much the very first picture in that style. Notwithstanding that, he was very, if you read his letters, he was a very emotional man, an age. He was very much a man for the age of feeling, and he felt very strongly. And I'm sure this was a very personal picture, and I'm sure that the unfinished in it, they occupy an unfinished world. I'm sure that is extremely significant. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, I'll have to be more telegrammic. How are we doing for time? You okay? Jean-Jacques Rousseau probably did more than anyone else to place the child at the center of discourse, as some people call it, in the 18th century. Rousseau was a revolutionary at the level of his attitude to the child. He said children should not be educated in the way that we've educated them so far. They spend far too much of their time with their noses in books. Child shouldn't read until they're 10. They should just be physical. They should understand the world, and we should change the clothes that they wear. We shouldn't swaddle them up. We shouldn't put little boys in young versions of adult costume. We should allow them to move their limbs freely. They should be able to play and swim and run and fish and do all these things. So it was Émile, or L'Éducation, was his masterwork on education. But what he was pleading for was a form of freedom. And Rousseau's ideas about freedom and about being unchained from attitudes that were bound up with the past and attitudes that were bound up with political structures aligned to create, or they aligned with an event called the French Revolution. And the idea of childhood as an ideal state. What was ideal about childhood? Childhood was the state to which we should return, a kind of heaven to which we should return in the secular reinterpretation of Christian structures of thought that took place in France and elsewhere during the late 18th century. Childhood became this blessed state, and it was blessed because it knew no rules. And if knowing no rules is blessed, if childhood is blessed, how can we transplant that into a political state? Well, we'll have to kill all the fathers and the mothers. We'll have to kill the king and the queen and the apparatus of government. And so it came to pass that they did. And if you go into the Pantheon, which is the great church that the revolutionaries deconsecrated and made the temple of their own achievement, what do you find in it? But this wooden casket. One of the things that the revolutionaries did, they also, like the English, destroyed all the art in churches, or as much of it as they could get their hands on, and declared themselves to be an atheistic state. But they needed the kind of mass drawing together power of the old religion and the old religious festivals. And so they invented these new festivals, and Jacques-Louis David was the pageant master of these festivals. And instead of taking the bones of a saint through the streets and placing the bones of the saint on the altar on the saint's day, no, they didn't do that. On the day of the liberation of the Bastille, they dug up the bones of Rousseau, the great Rousseau, who was their prophet, the man who said that we should all become as children of the revolution. They dug up his bones. They placed his bones in a wooden casket designed by one of the pupils of David. 200,000 people accompanied this casket into the Pantheon. And there it is. Rousseau's remains, still there in a chapel on the side, accompanied by a frieze. I mean, it's this pure folk art, but the frieze shows it's an old pagan festival of it's Ceres, it's wheat and fertility, but there's lots of children involved. And my favourite bit, I love the back of it. It's like Rousseau's dead, but the torch of his inspiration, his arm is forever sticking out of the back of his coffin. And I think actually that flame, if you think of the flame of Rousseau as being this idea about childhood and about children and about freedom from the structures of the past. Oh, I don't know where I've put that. Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, sorry, I didn't have it as an image, but another figure who I think, at the far end of that is you think of Piranesi, since we're in Venice, think of Piranesi and his images of prisons, these great sort of dark prisons, which are all created in the 18th century, around the same time that Rousseau's writing. What are those? But they are the image of what it is that we want to escape, and we escape by becoming as children, because to become as a child is to become remade, to become new. And you see it this is Madame Cerisier by David. And what you really don't want to do after the French Revolution is to wear posh, expensive clothes, because that's how you get your head cut off really, really quickly. So you'll suddenly see, again, if you run quickly through the Louvre, just like that, the women are no longer wearing these astonishing costumes that took 9 hours to get into. They're suddenly wearing these loose white shifts that make them look a little bit like classical sculptures. The French Revolution very much placed classical art at the center of its new cult of purity and freedom. And they're accompanied by their children, because she is the prophet of a new natural order in which children will be welcomed. Quickly we move through. I'm interested in this idea of what the child can then become. In Romantic culture, and this is by Philipp Otto Runge, it's called the Hulsenbeck children. And these children have this astonishing sort of primal energy. And again, it's a slight hypothesis, but these sort of children, I think there's a great letter by Runge where he says, not about these ones, not about that one, but about this one. This is a depiction of his own baby. He says, young Hans is so plump, he seems almost bulletproof. But there he is, like a kind of human marrow, growing growing and growing and growing. And there's something very compelling about Hulsenbeck's images of children, and they're being created at the same time as the Valhalla Monument is being erected, and the Germans, the poor beset upon Germans who've never been a nation of any kind, they've just been a tapestry of cultural fragments trodden over by other people in their wars. The Germans dare to think of being a nation, and I think that it's these images, these are the first images in which you can feel this. That's what's growing, that's what's being dreamed of. This idea of the child. The child is not a child. The child is, this is the German version of the French Enlightenment child, but they know that the French Revolution has taken place. So these are the revolutionaries of the future, I think, in Runge's imagination. And these images, they hung, it's very interesting that historically they have always been identified with the German nationalist cause, although they are only images of bourgeois artists and bourgeois artists' parents, children, and so on and so forth. They actually have this charge that it's hard to, you can see that child is not just a marrow, he's a bomb about to go off. There he is drawing, and he's no different when there's a drawing. He's bulletproof and he's going to blow up. Better get rid of him. And this, this element of, this was recognized. The status of these children as the harbingers of a German nationalism was, as in everything does in Germany from, say, 1850 to 1946, everything goes very bad, as we know. And guess who owned this picture? Adolf Hitler. This is a Runge painting. What's that? It's a room from a Nazi doll's house in the German National History Museum in Berlin. It's one of the most chilling objects that you could possibly see, but it's a very good example of how childhood and the cult of childhood and the association of childhood which developed from Rousseau to Runge, the association of childhood with a sense of Enlightenment, revolutionary potential, a sense of nationalism, a sense of national self-identification, was very quickly, as so many aspects of Romantic culture were, twisted and turned the wrong way, turned in this very sinister way by the Nazis. And so in another room of the doll's house, you'll see over the parents' bed, there's a painting of the Madonna della Sedia, one of the paintings that Hitler first stole from Florence. And in another room, I think the kitchen, there's a portrait of the Führer, which hangs directly above a radio. So in the doll's house, you're always listening to his speeches. And here in this room, you can't probably see properly, but the wallpaper shows the Hitler Youth. So the wallpaper shows young, say, 5-year-olds to 12-year-olds going walking in the Bavarian landscape to get the health and the fitness so that they will become very good soldiers for the Nazi cause. So everything in this house is sort of sick and twisted. It's a version of what childhood, having been co-opted by nationalism, will very, very quickly, can very quickly be turned into. This is a very odd image. This is from the V&A. Jack in the Green, it's a different subject, but the 19th century, on the one hand, establishes a kind of cult of the child, and on the other hand, is a period of appalling treatment of children, which is a paradox that many people find difficult to square. So at the beginning of our period, it's not quite contemporary with Rousseau, you have William Blake writing the poem about the Chimney Sweeps. And the Chimney Sweeps dream of being liberated from their coffins of black and being able to leap and prance upon the green. Then you fast forward to this image, 1862, Jacques Sylvestre. It's a wonderful document of a lost moment in the history of London. From about 1770 to the 1870s, they had, on May Day in London, they had a procession and a festival called Jack in the Green. And Jack in the Green is an old pagan god linked to ancient Rome who was preserved in English folklore and celebrated on May Day. And what he symbolized, he was personified by a walking hedge or a man completely covered in leaves. who you can see prancing about in the middle of Piccadilly in this image. And what he stood for was the annual regeneration of nature, that life comes from death. This tradition was kept alive in London, but it took a twist towards, as I say, the end of the 18th century, when the Chimney Sweeps it became their procession. It became their procession. So on May Day, all of the Chimney Sweeps of London were allowed only once out of the carcinogenic labyrinth of chimneys in which they spent their life. They were allowed out, and they would become, for one day, the rulers of London, and they could do whatever they want. They could take whatever sweets they wanted. They could just, it was their day. They could pluck you by the nose and you couldn't do anything about it. And this is the only depiction that I know that we have of this vivid, strange pagan festival, in which paradoxically, as the same paradox haunts Blake's poem, these children actually represent death. Because I was talking to a social historian about why would the Chimney Sweeps, why the Chimney Sweeps? And he said, well, in old England, you would always have a man completely covered in coal dust, a man made completely dark, and he would be replaced by the Jack in the Green on this May Day festival. So the Chimney Sweeps were naturally black. They were so black by their work, they couldn't become white ever. They were just dark people through soot. And they were allowed out on this one day. So it's a very peculiar, guilty sort of celebration of life from death, in which the youngest and the most put upon children, who were basically, they were sold to be chimney sweeps. They were effectively slaves living in 19th century London, climbing up these chimneys. They were allowed to be free for one day. But it must have seemed like a short day, and the next day must have been really bad. Alice in Wonderland. Well, we're in the 19th century, so I couldn't not include Alice in Wonderland. This idea, I think, which is partly responsible, I hope it's responsible for the fact that children's lives have got a lot better. This idea of childhood as something that's precious, something that's hard to squeeze into and very easy to grow out of, is encapsulated in the Alice stories. Modern artists become very interested in children. Again, because I think this association between childhood and the avant-garde is, if you want to reinvent everything, if you want to reinvent your own experience, I mean, you could say that the same is true of Wordsworth's Prelude. Wordsworth wants to reinvent poetry by returning to childhood experience and returning to direct language. What he does with that is another matter, but this idea that you remake things by becoming a child, you can somehow forget convention. And the ambition of modern art is to forget convention and invent everything again and again, so you're always new. So it's a dream about becoming a child, and Picasso says, he says that I could draw like Raphael when I was 15, but I've spent my life trying to paint like a 5-year-old. It's an interesting, that's Picasso, famous picture by Picasso of a child, but it's an interestingly, I think it's an interestingly flawed idea, actually, because I think the dream behind it, Picasso's dream, is that you can forget what you've learned and engage directly with your experience in the way that a 5-year-old child engages directly with experience, without conditioning, without etiquette, without worrying that you're, staring at somebody in a way that you shouldn't stare at them. You just don't worry about it. You stare at them and then you paint them. The problem with it, I think, is that it doesn't take sufficient account of the fact that being an adult is inevitable, and personally, so I think if Picasso had done what he seemed to say he's dreaming of, wouldn't all his pictures look different? Because he's like becoming a child each time that he paints a new picture. But I reckon I can always tell a Picasso from a mile off. So I don't know whether you become fresh by doing it. I think it's part of the dream of being fresh, but I'm not sure that it's actually the answer. I'm not sure it helped him out of the prison that every artist has to occupy, which is that of being themselves. It doesn't have to be a prison, but it's certainly a determining framework. I just end with this, my favorite book of the 20th century, which is Winnie the Pooh. And I can't think of another book that so poignantly, especially at the end, which I really have to be very careful about reading. There'll always be somewhere on that stretch of heath, there'll always be a little boy playing with his bear. But I think what it captures more brilliantly than any other book that I know is the way in which, when you leave being a child, when you stop being a child, you cross a line, but you don't know that you've crossed it. When you cross it, you don't know that you've crossed it. It's only afterwards that you realize, I wasn't a child after that, was I? And he captures that so brilliantly. And I think what I also love about those books, which is why I think this image is so fantastic. So Piglet is, as you know, in capital letters, a very small animal. And he's frightened of fierce animals. And whenever he is frightened in this way, Pooh will always hold his hand. Because it's all about love, really.